Welcome everybody to Write Better Together, Afterthoughts. I hope people don't think about our colons when I say colon in the middle of that, like that. Hey, look everybody, it's Emily Brooks.
Hello, John Meyers.
This is a very special Afterthoughts because we actually teased this in a previous episode. We're going to
Yes.
talk about how we name our characters.
Yes.
How do we name our characters, Emily Brooks?
So I had teased that Google probably thinks I'm always having a baby because I use Google, I go to babynames.com or
Okay.
baby a name. It may not be babynames.com. There's so many websites like that though. And that's often where I go to find names. Especially before I was writing fantasy, but even now writing fantasy. So before I wrote fantasy, I would look at what were the popular names from a certain decades. You can do that. So like you can look at just like the baby names from different decades. So you can look at when your character was born and do it that way. I try not to do it like super popular, but you want it to be kind of unique. And fit their personality and all of that. So I did that. Now that I write fantasy, I actually still do that because I usually my stories are usually set in a they're inspired by a time period or inspired by something. And so um I will sometimes, depending on the story. So let me go back. The story that I just wrote, the novel that I wrote about the people on the islands and they're trying to get food and stuff, I just tried to find names that sounded like they existed in the same world, that had similar structures and letters.
Were
But
they
my
actual
next story,
names?
hmm,
Were they actual names?
they're all made up.
Okay, so you
They're,
created
I
from
just made up
scratch.
names that sounded like they belonged together.
Got it.
Um, Whereas my next novel is taking place in a kind of an alternate history. And so I looked at that time period and then I made up names that sounded like names from that time.
So
So
your
like
next novel is speculative fiction. Is that what you're
it's
saying?
not it's not
It's not.
it's not categorically a alternate history. It does take place in a different world, but I'm
Oh,
kind
okay.
of treating it like an alternate history when I'm doing research.
Oh, this is fascinating. But that's not what this afterthought is about, but that's fascinating. World
The
building.
other thing that I do, and then I'm really fascinated to hear what you do, I try to make sure that the names don't sound too similar and that they don't begin with the same letter because you want people to easily distinguish them. So, what do you do?
For first of all, I'm often criticized like I don't know that rule to not have um similar uh, letter beginnings of their name. So one of these characters I'm going to talk about in a second, Carl, he has a sister named Caroline, and those are both similar, and people would say I shouldn't do that. I do
Mm.
that intentionally. There's two people in a different screenplay I wrote, George and Georgina. They're unrelated. They fall in love, and I do that on purpose. And so there's pairs of people, and I intentionally pair them that way. And it's a criticism I often get, and
Hmm.
but I know the rule, and I don't care.
I think, I actually think it's a little different for films, right? Because on a film, you can distinguish them because they're on camera. In a book, it's a little bit harder because you just have the name. But also, if they're like George and Georgina, like you have a man and a woman names as well, male female names, and so that also makes it maybe a little bit more clear
Well, it's
to
a it's
distinguish
one of
them.
those. There's so many unwritten screenwriting rules, and
Mm-hmm.
it's one of those for the same
Yeah,
reasons that you voiced earlier, and but I don't care. I have my reasons, and I'm the creator.
yeah, and
Um,
I mean, so much of this goes down to just being intentional. Thinking about it. If you're going to quote unquote break a rule, you want to know like what are your intentions behind it.
breaking a rule that doesn't exist in the first place.
Exactly. That's
Um,
why I said quote
so
unquote.
speaking of intentional, so one of the problems that new screenwriters have is that I'm not going to name any names, uh, but you know one of them. All their characters sound the same, and so and you can't do that in a screenplay, and
Yeah.
and so um, uh, that's a very common, like in film school you learn that that's a very common problem that new screenwriters have, and I
Yes.
solved it when I was a baby screenwriter, and I've continued that ever since. And so their names, I only name characters. They all have meaning. Those names mean things. That
Mm.
it's not anywhere in the story. It's not in the screenplay that they mean that. If a film were to get made, something I'm going to reveal 4 of them in this afterthought, and
Mm.
it might make an interesting in a director's cut afterwards. Hey, this
Sure.
this name really meant something. It's like a little Easter egg, and but it's because if I know the attitude of that person, there's no way they're going to sound the same as the other person in the scene because I know their name means something. And when I was new, I would keep a little spreadsheet to the side of what everyone's name meant. Now I don't. Now I'm good enough. I don't need to do that. I just know in their head. So I'll give you an example. So the antagonist in the screenplay that you're going to read that I'm going to send you, Carl Trudnick. Trudnick actually means something.
Mm.
So it also sounds like, doesn't that sound like a heavy antagonist named Trudnick? It's not like Holly Golightly or something, right?
Mhm.
And so, but Trudnick in Polish, Trudni, uh, uh, means how do I want to say this? Uh, it means difficult. Trudney means
Mm.
difficult. Well, Trudnik, when you put on this little ending, e, like the Polish ending EJSE, it's pronounced nich, right? And so that means more difficult.
Oh.
and so Trudnik literally means more. I've Americanized it, right? But
Mm.
it means more difficult. Well, that guy is not going to talk. He's not going to sound like Coach whatever that he's sitting in the lunchroom talking to, and because he's more difficult. His character is more
Mm.
difficult, and so I will never have that trouble of the 2 people sounding the same because their name is a little signal to me that he needs to be the more difficult person in the scene.
Interesting.
Um,
I do that
yeah.
in different ways, like I write not in their names, but I like write down what makes them tick. That that's very Dickensian of you, I feel like. I feel like Dickens he just like would make up names, I feel like, because they sounded
Um,
funny.
Thank you. So his Trudnick's mom, is Harriet Bezany, and Bezany is Polish for unmarried. And
Oh.
because his mom was unmarried, there's
Mm.
actually a scene of so they're twin. So Trudnick is actually a twin. I don't think it matters in the one that you're going to read, but in a different story that I wrote with them, um, uh, the dad is there at this traumatic childbirth when she gave birth to the twins, and but she was unmarried. She's
Mm.
still unmarried now now that Trudnick's 50 years old, but she was unmarried at the time of his birth as well, at the birth of the twins. The
Mm.
guy was present. Then he no, then he dies. Oh, spoiler alert, he dies
Oh wow.
at the
Spoiler.
childbirth. And uh but so anyway, so she's always been unmarried. She was unmarried at the time of birth. She's unmarried now. So that's where that came from. There's another character, Dean Toit. Guess what Toit means? Toit is Yiddish for dead. Guess who dies?
Oh.
So in a different screenplay, one of the characters is moving it. They're taking down Toit's parking sign on his parking spot, and because he had died, right? But I think I don't remember the screenplay I'm giving you. I don't remember if he dies in that, but he eventually dies. Um, in my supernatural thriller, his granddaughter is one of the college girls at this college. Totally separate story. It has nothing to do with him. And but so her name, which I can't remember her first name right now, Cindy Toit. So guess who dies in that? Toit dies in that screenplay as well. So
Wow.
again, she's not going to sound like anyone else because I know her fate. When we get to page 75, I know
Hmm.
that her fate. I have to keep that in mind at all times. Well, it's right there in her name, and it's right there in Dean Toit's name that he's eventually going to be dead because that's what his name is. Um, One last example. So there is a character. I can't remember if she's in the one that you're going to read. I can't remember if she's in that one or not. I think she is. And she's a sports reporter, a newspaper sports reporter. And back at the turn of the century, so 1903, 1908, there weren't a lot of them. Um, Actually, if you Google them now, now that AI is like infiltrated Google, you won't even get this. It'll say the first female sports reporter was in 1947 or what. No, there was there was an actual real one, and her name I had to write it down because I always forget her name. Her name was Ina Eloise Young. She later got married, and so her name was Ina Young. I can't read her. I can't read my own handwriting. Ina Young Kelly, I think, and so I wanted to pay homage to that because she actually became the first female sports editor for a newspaper, like in 1908. She wasn't even allowed to go to the Columbia School of Journalism, and but she became the for a paper in Colorado, and so this character is Rosalina Ina, and so that's paying attention or paying homage to Ina Young Kelly. And so because she's a groundbreaker, she's ahead of her time. Rosalina means gentle horse. And
Nice.
so gentle horse,
Wow.
but she's the first, she's a sports reporter, which would have been rare back then. So which would have been rare back then. And so that I she again will sound like everyone not different in the scene because she's ahead of her time and she's forward thinking and
Nice.
in more ways than one.
I
So
like that a
that's all I have
lot.
to say about that. So almost every name means something.
I love that. I don't do that at all. And so that's really interesting, an interesting way to think about it. I like the idea of like the name even triggering something for you when you're writing. It's like, oh yeah, that's a reminder of who this character is.
And
That's
now it's
very cool.
second nature. So I
Mhm.
don't even consciously think that. I just know Shrudnick's a bunch of trouble, right? He's and so it's going to come out. They will never sound the same. There you go.
There you go.
And we
We
couldn't
couldn't have
have
done
done it
it
without
without
you.
you.